I arrived at my childhood home carrying homemade pumpkin bread, wearing my best navy dress for what I thought would be our traditional Thanksgiving dinner. But my parents blocked the doorway, their faces cold as winter stone. "You're not invited," my mother said flatly. "Go home." Through the living room window, I could see my younger sister Madison laughing loudly, Uncle Paul carving turkey, and most shocking of all, my best friend Jessica from college, sitting at our family table like she belonged there. The warm golden light inside made their joy seem almost mocking. Stunned and humiliated beyond words, I simply nodded, walked back to my car with shaking hands, and made one phone call to my lawyer cousin Derek in Seattle. 20 minutes later, my phone started buzzing frantically with notifications as angry voices began echoing from inside the house. Sitting in my Honda Civic outside the house where I grew up, I felt like someone had hollowed out my chest with a rusty spoon. The November wind rattled my windows as memories crashed over me like brutal waves. 3 months earlier, I had discovered text messages on my fiancé Marcus's phone from an unknown number. The messages were intimate, affectionate, completely devastating. When I confronted him about them in our shared apartment, Marcus exploded with accusations I never saw coming. "You're controlling Eugenia," he had shouted, throwing his keys across our kitchen counter. "You check my phone, you question everything I do. You're suffocating me." His words felt like physical blows. "I need space. This engagement is over." He twisted the diamond ring off my finger with such force it left a red mark on my skin. What broke my heart even more was my family's reaction. Instead of supporting me through the worst moment of my life, they sided with Marcus completely. My father, Harold, actually called me 2 weeks after the breakup to lecture me about driving away a good man. "Marcus is successful, responsible, and he genuinely cared about you," he said in that disappointed tone I remembered from childhood mistakes. "Maybe you should look at your own behavior instead of blaming him." My mother, Sandra, was even harsher. During our last phone conversation, she suggested I seek therapy for my trust issues. "Healthy relationships require faith, not suspicion," she said, her voice dripping with judgment. "Marcus deserves better than constant interrogation." Even Madison, my 24-year-old sister, who used to call me her hero, started avoiding my calls. When she finally answered 3 weeks ago, she sounded distant and strange. "Maybe Marcus was right about you being possessive," she said quietly. "You always did have control problems even when we were kids." The isolation felt like drowning in slow motion. My family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had written me off as the villain in my own heartbreak story. They believed I was unstable, controlling, mentally unfit for a healthy relationship. The shame consumed me daily. But tonight, seeing Jessica wearing my engagement ring through that window changed everything. Jessica Martinez had been my roommate junior year at Arizona State University. We studied together, shared secrets, supported each other through difficult classes and bad dates. She was supposed to be my maid of honor before Marcus destroyed our engagement. Now she sat at my family's table, laughing with my relatives, wearing the ring that once symbolized my future. The phone call I made was to my cousin Derek Thompson in Seattle. Derek had always been the family success story, a federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. More importantly, he was the only family member who still believed in my character. 2 weeks ago, when I mentioned my suspicions about Marcus's construction company finances, Derek had offered to investigate quietly. "Something doesn't add up about his business model," I had told Derek during a tearful late-night conversation. "He claims to build affordable housing for veterans, but the numbers never made sense to me. The profit margins seemed impossible." Derek had promised to look into it, but I never expected results this quickly. As I sat in my car watching my former life through a window, my phone started vibrating with incoming messages. Derek's name appeared on my screen, followed by a text that made my blood freeze. "Marcus has been defrauding veteran housing programs. Federal investigation beginning tomorrow. Don't contact anyone yet." Inside the house, I could see movement near the windows. Madison's face appeared and she mouthed words I couldn't hear but could easily interpret from her cruel expression. Behind her, Jessica lifted her hand to display my old engagement ring, prominently smiling with calculated malice. Uncle Paul raised his beer bottle in what looked like a toast, completely unaware of the storm about to break over their celebration. My phone buzzed again with another message from Derek. Evidence suggests family involvement. Trust no one. We'll talk tomorrow. As I drove away from the house that no longer felt like home, I realized that the betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just about a broken engagement or family disappointment. This was about something much darker, more calculated, more devastating than simple misunderstanding. The taillights of other cars blurred through my tears as I headed toward my apartment, but for the first time in months, I felt something besides despair. I felt the cold, sharp edge of determination cutting through my grief. Whatever had happened to destroy my life, I was finally going to get answers. Derek's investigation revealed horrors I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. At 8 a.m, he called from his hotel room in downtown Phoenix, his prosecutor's voice tight with controlled anger. "Eugenia, you need to sit down for this conversation. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about your family." Marcus's construction company, Patriot Building Solutions, had been systematically defrauding federal veteran housing programs for almost 2 years. The scheme was sophisticated, cruel, and unbelievably profitable. Marcus would identify disabled veterans struggling financially, then offer to help them apply for government housing assistance. He would fill out falsified applications, claiming these veterans needed extensive home modifications for their disabilities, inflating costs by 300 to 400%. But the worst part was how he funded these fraudulent projects. "Your father co-signed multiple construction loans using his pristine credit and military veteran status." Derek explained, his voice heavy with disgust. Harold believed he was helping disabled veterans get affordable housing, but Marcus was pocketing the government subsidies meant for people who desperately needed help. My father, the man who taught me about honor and integrity, had unknowingly become complicit in stealing from the most vulnerable members of our military community. Harold's veteran status and spotless credit history made him the perfect dupe for Marcus's scheme. My father genuinely thought he was performing charity work signing loan documents to help fellow veterans access government benefits they deserved. The total fraud amount exceeds $2 million, Derek continued. Federal investigators have been building this case for 6 months. Your family ostracized you because Marcus convinced them you were mentally unstable and might expose the operation if you discovered it accidentally. The cruelty of the manipulation stole my breath. Marcus had systematically poisoned my family against me to protect his criminal enterprise. Every conversation where my parents questioned my judgment, every suggestion that I needed therapy, every disappointed look and cold shoulder had been orchestrated to isolate me completely. After Derek hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling like the walls were closing in around me. That's when I noticed the eviction notices scattered on my coffee table. 3 legal documents demanding immediate payment of 4 months back, rent totaling $6,800. My landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been calling for weeks, but I assumed it was routine maintenance requests. I called her immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. Mrs. Chen answered on the second ring, her voice cautious and uncomfortable. "Eugenia, I'm sorry about the eviction notices, but I had no choice. Your father called me 2 months ago explaining your situation." "What situation?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. "He said you were having a mental health crisis after your breakup. He explained that you couldn't manage your finances anymore and that your family was considering guardianship proceedings. He seemed so concerned and genuine." Mrs. Chen paused, clearly regretting the conversation. "He also said you might become hostile or aggressive when confronted about missed payments due to your emotional instability." The room started spinning around me. Harold had systematically destroyed my housing situation using lies about my mental health, but the financial devastation went beyond just rent payments. When I logged into my online banking, I discovered that Marcus had somehow removed my name from our joint savings account 3 weeks after our breakup. $14,000 of my money had vanished completely. The account that once held my emergency fund vacation savings and wedding deposits now showed a balance of $37.52. Marcus had cleaned out everything we accumulated during our 2-year relationship, leaving me financially destroyed while planning his celebration with my best friend. Jessica's betrayal cut deeper than I expected. As a branch manager at Desert Community Bank, she had access to customer account information and transfer protocols. Derek's preliminary investigation revealed that Jessica had helped Marcus move my savings through multiple accounts before finally transferring the money to offshore banking systems in the Cayman Islands. She used her professional position to facilitate the theft, Derek explained during his second call. Jessica created false documentation, claiming you authorized the transfers due to mental health concerns. She forged your signature on documents giving Marcus power of attorney over your joint financial assets. The sophisticated nature of their conspiracy became clearer with each revelation. This wasn't a spontaneous decision after our breakup. Marcus and Jessica had been planning this theft for months, possibly years. They needed my family's cooperation to sell the story of my mental instability, so Marcus cultivated relationships with Harold and Sandra long before he proposed to me. Every family dinner where Marcus charmed my parents, every conversation where he expressed concern about my behavior, every suggestion that I seemed stressed or unstable had been calculated manipulation. He was building a narrative that would justify stealing my money and destroying my relationships simultaneously. By evening, I sat surrounded by legal documents, bank statements, and Derek's investigation notes, feeling like a detective piecing together my own murder. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its completeness. My fiancé, my best friend, and my family had collaborated to rob me blind while convincing themselves I was the problem. But something else was bothering me, something Derek hadn't mentioned yet. How had Marcus gained access to information about my finances in the first place? Jessica could explain the banking fraud, but Marcus had known details about my inheritance and family assets that I had never shared with him directly. That night, as I tried to fall asleep on my couch, surrounded by evidence of my destroyed life, one terrible possibility kept me awake. What if the conspiracy reached even deeper into my family than Derek had discovered? What if someone I trusted completely had been feeding Marcus information from the very beginning? The thought terrified me because it pointed toward a betrayal so fundamental, so complete, that it would shatter every assumption I had about love, family, and trust. 3 days of relentless investigation with Derek revealed a truth so devastating that I vomited when he first explained it to me. My mother, Sandra, wasn't just a passive victim of Marcus's manipulation. She was the architect of the entire conspiracy, the puppet master pulling every string that destroyed my life. The revelation began when Derek obtained my grandmother Rose's estate documents from Maricopa County Probate Court. Grandma Rose had passed away 14 months earlier, leaving me a substantial inheritance that I knew nothing about. The inheritance included $130,000 in cash, plus a valuable commercial property in downtown Phoenix, worth approximately $400,000. Your grandmother specifically excluded Sandra from the will. Derek explained, his voice hollow with disbelief. Rose left detailed documentation explaining that Sandra had repeatedly asked for loans and financial help over the years, money that was never repaid. She believed Sandra was financially irresponsible and would waste any inheritance on gambling or frivolous spending. Instead, Grandma Rose left everything to me with a letter explaining her decision. She wanted me to have financial security and independence, knowing I had always been responsible with money and career-focused. The letter, written in Rose's careful handwriting, expressed her pride in my marketing career and her hope that the inheritance would help me achieve my dreams. But Sandra had intercepted all the probate communications before I could receive them. As my mother, an emergency contact, she was notified about Rose's death and will reading. Sandra attended the probate proceedings, learned about my substantial inheritance, and immediately began planning how to steal it. Sandra's gambling debts with Harold total over $80,000. Derek continued showing me casino records and credit card statements his investigator had obtained. She owed money to multiple casinos, had maxed out 6 credit cards, and was facing potential bankruptcy. Your inheritance represented a way out of financial ruin. The timeline of Sandra's manipulation was sickening in its calculation. Within days of learning about my inheritance, she had contacted Marcus and proposed a partnership. Sandra knew that as my fiancé, Marcus would eventually gain access to my financial assets after marriage. She offered him a deal: seduce me, marry me, steal the inheritance, and split the profits 60-40. Marcus initially refused, but Sandra sweetened the offer by introducing him to the veteran housing fraud opportunity. Harold's veteran status and excellent credit could fund construction loans, while Sandra's nursing background helped her identify vulnerable disabled veterans to target. Marcus would profit from both the federal fraud and my inheritance theft simultaneously. Jessica's involvement came later, recruited by Sandra through their connection at the bank. Sandra had been Jessica's customer for years and knew about her financial struggles after her divorce. Sandra offered Jessica $50,000 to help facilitate the banking fraud, using her position as branch manager to legitimize the theft of my accounts. The most crushing betrayal was how Sandra had orchestrated my emotional destruction. Every family conversation where my parents criticized my relationship behavior had been scripted by Sandra. She coached Harold on exactly what to say to make me doubt myself, fed him specific examples of my supposed controlling tendencies, and convinced him that Marcus was genuinely concerned about my mental health. Your mother told Harold that Marcus had confided in her about your erratic behavior. Derek explained, reading from recorded conversations his investigator had captured. She claimed you had threatened suicide during arguments, that you had accused Marcus of cheating without evidence, that you had become increasingly paranoid and unstable. None of it was true, but Harold believed his wife completely. Sandra had manipulated my father's love for me, convincing him that supporting Marcus was actually protecting me from my own destructive impulses. Harold thought he was participating in an intervention, not a conspiracy. The fake breakup had been Sandra's idea. Marcus was supposed to stage a dramatic fight, move out temporarily, and then return after a few weeks, claiming he wanted to work things out. During the separation, they planned to convince me to give Marcus temporary power of attorney over my finances for wedding planning purposes. Once they had legal access to my accounts, they would clean them out and disappear. But something had gone wrong with their timeline. Derek's investigation revealed that federal authorities had been monitoring Marcus's construction company longer than anyone realized. Sandra panicked when she learned about the federal investigation, pushing Marcus to accelerate the theft before investigators froze his assets. That's why the breakup became permanent instead of temporary, Derek explained. Sandra realized they needed to complete the financial theft immediately and permanently destroy your credibility as a witness. If you were perceived as mentally unstable and vindictive, after a bad breakup, no one would believe your testimony about the fraud. The Thanksgiving gathering wasn't a family dinner. It was a celebration of successfully stealing my inheritance and destroying my life. Sandra had convinced Harold that excluding me was necessary for my own good, claiming that seeing Marcus and Jessica together would trigger another mental health crisis. She told Madison that I had become dangerous and unpredictable, that family members needed to maintain distance for their own safety. Uncle Paul's presence was particularly strategic. As a former military investigator, his approval would validate the story that Marcus was genuinely helping veterans. Sandra coached Marcus on exactly what to tell Paul about the construction projects, providing enough real details to make the fraud seem legitimate. The final piece of evidence was a recording Derek's investigator had made of Sandra and Jessica celebrating at a downtown Phoenix restaurant the night before Thanksgiving. The two women had gotten drunk and discussed their plans for spending my inheritance money. Sandra wanted to pay off her gambling debts and take Harold on an expensive cruise. Jessica planned to buy a new house and car. They never expected you to figure out what really happened. Derek said, his voice tight with anger. Sandra believed she had successfully convinced everyone that you were mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. She thought the inheritance theft would be blamed on your poor judgment, not recognized as fraud. As Derek finished explaining the conspiracy, I realized that Sandra had destroyed more than just my finances. She had weaponized my family's love against me, turning my father's protective instincts and my sister's trust into tools for my own destruction. She had convinced people who were supposed to protect me that I was the threat they needed protection from. But the most devastating realization was that Sandra had been planning this betrayal since the day Grandma Rose died. Every hug, every family dinner, every conversation where she seemed concerned about my well-being had been a performance designed to position herself for the ultimate theft. My mother had looked into my eyes for 14 months, knowing she was stealing my inheritance and destroying my future, and never showed a trace of guilt or remorse. That level of calculated cruelty was almost impossible for me to comprehend. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by evidence of my mother's betrayal, I realized that this wasn't just about money. This was about a complete destruction of trust family bonds and basic human decency. Sandra had committed psychological murder, systematically killing every relationship I valued while enriching herself from my emotional corpse. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated both my intelligence and my cousin Derek's legal expertise. Tomorrow we would begin the process of getting justice for what she had done to me and the veterans she had helped defraud. What Sandra, Marcus, and Jessica didn't know was that I had been gathering evidence against them for 3 weeks before that devastating Thanksgiving confrontation. My grandmother Rose had taught me to be observant and careful, lessons that saved my life when I needed them most. Derek arrived at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport at 6 in the morning with FBI financial crimes investigator, Agent Patricia Williams. Agent Williams was a small woman with steel gray hair and the most intimidating stare I had ever encountered. She had been tracking Marcus's veteran fraud operation for 8 months as part of a larger federal task force investigating contractor fraud across the Southwest. Your cousin contacted me 2 weeks ago with evidence that accelerated our timeline significantly, Agent Williams explained, as we sat in a conference room at the federal building downtown. We had been planning to move in spring, but the sophistication of the banking fraud involving Jessica Martinez required immediate action. What Agent Williams didn't know was that I had suspected the conspiracy for almost a month. 3 weeks earlier, while helping clean out my grandmother's house, I found Rose's hidden diary tucked behind a loose board in her bedroom closet. The diary detailed Sandra's previous attempts to steal from Rose, including forged checks, unauthorized credit card usage, and a failed attempt to have Rose declared mentally incompetent. Your mother tried to have me committed to a nursing home 2 years ago, Rose had written in shaky handwriting. She brought a doctor friend who claimed I was showing signs of dementia. I pretended to be confused during the evaluation, but I was taking notes. Sandra wants my money more than she loves her own mother. Reading Rose's diary was like looking into a crystal ball showing my own future. Sandra had used the exact same tactics against Rose that she later used against me: claims of mental instability, manipulation of family members, attempts to gain financial control through false medical evaluations. The pattern was unmistakable. Armed with this knowledge, I had started documenting everything. I wore a small recording device during every family interaction, capturing Sandra's careful manipulation and Harold's unwitting participation. I photographed documents Marcus left behind in our shared apartment, including construction contracts with suspicious veteran signatures. I tracked Jessica's behavior at the bank, noting how she avoided eye contact and seemed nervous whenever I mentioned my accounts. Most importantly, I had started working with Mrs. Rodriguez, my childhood neighbor who had always been like a second grandmother to me. Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed strange cars parked outside my apartment at odd hours and men in suits asking questions about my character and mental stability. When Sandra approached Mrs. Rodriguez asking her to lie about my behavior to authorities, Mrs. Rodriguez immediately called me. "Your mother offered me $500 to tell social services that you had been acting erratic and dangerous." Mrs. Rodriguez explained, her voice shaking with indignation. "She wanted me to say you had threatened neighbors and seemed disconnected from reality. I told her I would never lie about you, but I was worried about what she might do next." The recording device captured Sandra's attempts to bribe Mrs. Rodriguez, creating additional evidence of conspiracy and witness tampering. But the most damning evidence came from Sandra herself during what she thought was a private conversation with Harold in their kitchen. "The inheritance money will solve all our problems," Sandra had said, unaware that I was recording through an open window while pretending to garden in Mrs. Rodriguez's yard. "Once Marcus transfers everything offshore, we pay off the casino debts, buy Harold's silence about the construction fraud, and start fresh somewhere else. Eugenia will never figure out what really happened." Agent Williams listened to the recordings with professional fascination. This level of premeditation elevates the charges significantly. We're looking at federal conspiracy wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse charges against your grandmother's estate. Derek had coordinated with Agent Williams to live stream the simultaneous arrests through his laptop, giving me a front row seat to watch justice unfold. At exactly 11:30 on Thanksgiving morning, while my family was carving turkey and toasting their successful theft of my inheritance, FBI agents executed search warrants at 3 locations simultaneously. The first team raided Marcus's construction office, seizing computers, financial records, and falsified veteran documentation. The second team arrived at Desert Community Bank to arrest Jessica and confiscate her work computer containing evidence of banking fraud. The third team knocked on my parents' front door, presenting search and arrest warrants as my extended family watched in horror. Through Derek's live stream, I could see the chaos unfolding in my childhood living room. Agent Williams identified herself and began reading federal charges as Sandra's face drained of all color. Harold looked completely bewildered, still holding his carving knife, as agents explained his unwitting participation in veteran housing fraud. Madison started crying, finally understanding that the family gathering was actually a criminal conspiracy celebration. Uncle Paul immediately distanced himself from the group, raising his hands and explaining his law enforcement background. Jessica tried to run from the bank, but was intercepted in the parking lot by additional agents. Marcus attempted to destroy his office computer, but agents had already secured the building and documented his attempted evidence destruction. The most satisfying moment came when Agent Williams played one of my recordings of Sandra discussing the inheritance theft. As Sandra's own voice filled the living room confessing to orchestrating my financial destruction and emotional abuse, Harold dropped his carving knife and stared at his wife with complete devastation. "You knew?" Harold asked Sandra, his voice breaking. "You knew Marcus was stealing from veterans. You helped him steal from our daughter." Sandra tried to deny everything, but Agent Williams had hours of recorded conversations documenting her leadership role in the conspiracy. As handcuffs clicked around Sandra's wrists, she finally looked directly into Derek's camera and realized I was watching her arrest in real time. "You think you've won," Sandra snarled, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "You're still a pathetic, desperate woman who couldn't keep a man. Money won't change that." But I wasn't the same broken person she had spent months destroying. As I watched my mother being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete overwhelming relief. The truth was finally exposed. The criminals were facing justice, and I was no longer alone in my fight for vindication. Agent Williams turned to the camera and spoke directly to me. "Ms. Thompson, your evidence and cooperation have helped us recover assets and protect other victims. The nightmare is over." For the first time since Marcus broke our engagement, I smiled genuinely. The conspiracy that had destroyed my life was finally unraveling, and the people who had betrayed me were about to face the consequences of their choices. The biggest shock in this entire nightmare came when Uncle Paul revealed his true role in the Thanksgiving gathering. As FBI agents finished processing the crime scene in my parents' living room, Paul approached Derek's camera and identified himself as Special Investigator Paul Morrison, working undercover for the Department of Veterans Affairs. "I've been investigating Marcus's construction company for 4 months." Paul explained, his familiar voice now carrying professional authority I had never heard before. "Derek contacted me 6 weeks ago when Eugenia first raised concerns about the veteran housing projects. We've been coordinating this operation ever since." My uncle, who I thought was just a retired postal worker with military experience, was actually a federal investigator specializing in veteran benefit fraud. His jovial personality and family connections made him the perfect undercover operative to infiltrate Marcus's operation and document the scope of criminal activity. The Thanksgiving gathering was a setup. Paul continued looking directly into the camera. "We needed to record final confessions and gather all remaining conspirators in one location. Sandra believed she was celebrating a successful theft, but she was actually providing us with the last pieces of evidence we needed for federal prosecution." Paul's investigation had revealed that Marcus's Patriot Building Solutions was far more than a simple fraud scheme. The company served as a hub for multiple criminal enterprises targeting vulnerable populations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. Marcus had partnerships with corrupt contractors, dishonest medical evaluators, and compromised bank employees in 6 different cities. "We've identified over 200 victims," Agent Williams explained during a follow-up briefing. "Disabled veterans, elderly homeowners, immigrant families seeking legitimate construction services, and small business owners who trusted Marcus with renovation projects. The total fraud amount exceeds $8 million across 3 states. Jessica Martinez's position at Desert Community Bank had been crucial to the entire operation. As a branch manager, she could approve questionable transactions, override security protocols, and access customer information for identity theft purposes. Her banking credentials allowed the criminal network to launder money through dozens of innocent customer accounts, making the fraud nearly impossible to trace through traditional methods. Jessica created false documentation for victims across the Southwest," Agent Williams continued. "She would open accounts using stolen veteran information process, fraudulent government benefit payments, and then transfer the money through offshore banking networks. Her cooperation with Marcus gave the operation legitimacy that other criminal partnerships lacked." But the most disturbing revelation was how Sandra had planned to destroy my credibility permanently. Paul's investigation uncovered a detailed plan to have me declared mentally incompetent, giving Harold power of attorney over all my assets, including the inheritance I didn't even know existed. Sandra had contacted 3 different psychiatric evaluators about having you committed involuntarily. Paul explained, showing me falsified medical records with my name. "She planned to claim you were suicidal, delusional, and potentially dangerous to yourself and others. The evaluators were prepared to sign commitment papers based entirely on Sandra and Harold's testimony about your behavior. The commitment plan would have given Harold legal control over my finances, while I spent months or years fighting for my release from psychiatric custody. During that time, Marcus and Sandra could have emptied my inheritance, completely sold Grandma Rose's property, and disappeared with millions of dollars while I was locked away and helpless. Your grandmother's diary saved your life," Derek added. "When you showed me Rose's documentation of Sandra's previous fraud attempts, we realized this wasn't an isolated crime. Sandra had been planning systematic theft for years, using family relationships to identify and exploit victims. Mrs. Rodriguez's testimony provided additional evidence of Sandra's witness tampering and intimidation tactics. Sandra had approached 4 different neighbors asking them to report concerns about my mental health to various authorities. She offered bribes, made threats, and even claimed I had been violent toward Harold to convince people to lie about my character. She told Mrs. Patterson that you had pushed Harold down the stairs," Paul revealed, referring to my elderly neighbor 3 houses down. She claimed you were using drugs and had become unpredictable around family members. Mrs. Patterson refused to lie, but Sandra had backup witnesses ready to testify against you if needed. The scope of Sandra's planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness. She had anticipated every possible obstacle to her theft plan and developed strategies to overcome them. She researched commitment laws, identified corrupt medical professionals, and practiced her emotional manipulation techniques on multiple family members until she perfected them. Marcus's construction company served as more than just a fraud vehicle. Paul's investigation revealed that Marcus was also involved in labor trafficking, bringing undocumented workers from Mexico under false pretenses and forcing them to work for substandard wages on fraudulent construction projects. The workers believed they were participating in legitimate government housing programs for veterans unaware that their labor was being used to defraud the same veterans they were trying to help. We've rescued 18 undocumented workers who were essentially enslaved by Marcus's operation, Agent Williams explained. They were promised green cards and steady employment, but instead were housed in substandard conditions and threatened with deportation if they complained about working conditions or pay. The human cost of Sandra's greed extended far beyond my personal devastation. Dozens of disabled veterans had been robbed of benefits they desperately needed. Immigrant families had been exploited and threatened. Elderly homeowners had lost their life savings to fraudulent renovation contracts. Small business owners had been destroyed financially by Marcus's fake partnership agreements. Jessica's arrest at the bank had triggered additional discoveries about the scope of financial fraud. Her work computer contained evidence of money laundering operations involving over 300 customer accounts. She had been systematically stealing small amounts from multiple accounts over 2 years, counting on customers not noticing minor discrepancies in their monthly statements. The bank fraud alone involves over $1 million in theft from innocent customers. Agent Williams continued. Jessica used her position to authorize overdraft fees, process unauthorized transfers, and manipulate interest calculations. Many victims were elderly customers who trusted her completely. As the investigation expanded, federal authorities coordinated with state and local agencies to arrest additional conspirators across the Southwest. Marcus's network included corrupt building inspectors, dishonest medical evaluators, compromised bank employees, and crooked legal professionals who helped create false documentation for fraud victims. But perhaps the most satisfying discovery was that Sandra's gambling debts were actually much larger than anyone realized. Her financial desperation had driven her to borrow money from extremely dangerous people who would not be satisfied with partial repayment. The casino debts were just the beginning of Sandra's financial problems. Your mother owes nearly $200,000 to various criminal organizations, Paul revealed. The inheritance theft wasn't just about greed. Sandra was in genuine fear for her life from loan sharks and illegal gambling operations. She needed your money to avoid potentially violent consequences from her creditors. Knowing that Sandra's betrayal was motivated by desperate fear rather than simple greed provided some psychological comfort, but it didn't excuse the calculated cruelty of her methods. She had still chosen to destroy her own daughter's life rather than face the consequences of her gambling addiction, honestly. As we sat in the federal building conference room surrounded by evidence boxes and legal documents, I realized that this investigation had exposed a criminal empire that extended far beyond my personal nightmare. My inheritance theft was just one small component of a massive fraud operation that had been destroying lives across multiple states for years. But thanks to Paul's undercover work, Derek's legal expertise, and my determination to document everything we had brought down the entire network and protected future victims from similar exploitation, the federal asset forfeiture laws worked in my favor more dramatically than Derek had initially predicted. Within 6 weeks of the arrests, I had recovered not only my complete inheritance, but received substantial additional compensation from the seizure of criminal assets across Marcus's entire fraud network. The Department of Justice's asset forfeiture program allowed law enforcement to confiscate money, property, and financial instruments used in the commission of federal crimes. Since Marcus had used my inheritance to fund additional fraud operations, expand his criminal network, and purchase luxury assets for his criminal enterprise, everything became recoverable under federal seizure laws. The total recovery amount exceeds $1.2 million. Derek explained as we met with federal prosecutors to finalize asset distribution. Your inheritance compensation for emotional damages, restitution from the banking fraud, and your share of assets seized from the broader criminal organization. The money recovery was deeply satisfying, but the emotional vindication meant even more to me. Mrs. Rodriguez had become my strongest advocate, organizing neighborhood support and publicly defending my character to anyone who would listen. She spent hours calling community members, explaining how Sandra had tried to bribe neighbors into lying about my mental health and describing the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy. Everyone knows the truth now, Mrs. Rodriguez told me as we sat on her front porch, watching FBI vehicles remove evidence from my parents' house across the street. Sandra fooled Harold and Madison, but she never fooled the neighbors who really know you. We always knew you were a good person being treated unfairly. Harold's reaction to learning the truth about Sandra's betrayal was heartbreaking to witness. Derek shared recordings of Harold's FBI interview where my father broke down completely while learning about the scope of Sandra's manipulation and lies. She told me Eugenia was having violent episodes, Harold said through tears during his recorded statement. She showed me scratches on her arms that she claimed came from Eugenia attacking her during an argument. She made me believe my daughter was dangerous and needed professional help. Harold had genuinely believed he was protecting me by supporting Marcus and excluding me from family gatherings. Sandra had convinced him that maintaining distance was necessary for my psychological recovery and everyone's physical safety. Learning that he had been manipulated into betraying his own daughter devastated Harold completely. I signed those loan documents because Sandra said we were helping disabled veterans get housing assistance, Harold continued in his statement. She explained that Marcus was a legitimate contractor who needed co-signers to secure government funding for charity projects. I thought I was doing community service, not participating in fraud. The FBI interviews revealed that Harold had no knowledge of the inheritance theft, the banking fraud, or the systematic destruction of my reputation. Sandra had compartmentalized information, carefully ensuring Harold only knew details that would make him a useful collaborator without making him a willing criminal participant. Madison's transformation was equally dramatic. Once she understood the truth about Sandra's manipulation and Marcus's crimes, she became fiercely protective of me and deeply ashamed of her previous behavior. "I'm so sorry, Eugenia," Madison said during our first conversation after the arrests. "Mom convinced me that you were having a breakdown and that Marcus was genuinely concerned about your well-being. She showed me text messages that she claimed were from you, threatening suicide and blaming everyone for your problems." The text messages were completely fabricated. Sandra had created fake conversations using my phone number and contact information to convince Madison that I was emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. Madison genuinely believed she was protecting herself and our parents by maintaining distance from me during my supposed mental health crisis. She told me that therapists recommended family members avoid contact with you until you completed intensive treatment, Madison continued. She made it sound like seeing family would trigger worse episodes and potentially prevent your recovery. Sandra had used Madison's love for me against both of us, convincing my sister that abandonment was actually compassion. The psychological manipulation was so sophisticated that Madison felt guilty for caring about me, believing her concern might actually harm my mental health recovery. Derek helped me purchase our childhood home at the federal asset auction after Harold and Sandra's property was seized to pay restitution to fraud victims. Standing in my old bedroom, now legally owned by me instead of my parents, felt like the ultimate symbolic victory over Sandra's attempted destruction of my life. Jessica Martinez received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison for banking fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. Her banking career was permanently destroyed, her financial credentials revoked, and her personal assets seized to compensate victims. During her sentencing hearing, she attempted to apologize to me through her attorney. Ms. Martinez wants you to know that she deeply regrets her participation in this conspiracy. Her lawyer read from a prepared statement. She was motivated by financial desperation and poor judgment, not malice towards you personally. But I had no interest in Jessica's apologies or explanations. Her betrayal of our friendship was just as calculated as Sandra's betrayal of our family relationship. Jessica had looked into my eyes for months while planning to steal my money and destroy my life, never showing any trace of guilt or remorse. Marcus received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and labor trafficking charges. His construction company was permanently dissolved, his professional licenses revoked, and his personal assets distributed to victims. The federal judge described his crimes as particularly heinous due to his exploitation of disabled veterans and undocumented workers. Mr. Williams targeted the most vulnerable members of our society for personal enrichment, Judge Patricia Hendricks said during sentencing. He stole from people who sacrificed for our country and exploited workers who came here seeking better lives. These crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of American values and human decency. Marcus showed no remorse during his sentencing, claiming he was a victim of government overreach and prosecutorial misconduct. He refused to take responsibility for his crimes or acknowledge the harm he had caused to hundreds of victims across the Southwest. Sandra received the harshest sentence of 14 years in federal prison for conspiracy, elder abuse, fraud, and racketeering charges. The federal prosecutors argued that her role as the mastermind of the inheritance theft and family manipulation made her the most culpable defendant in the entire case. Sandra Thompson orchestrated a criminal conspiracy that destroyed families, exploited veterans, and traumatized her own daughter. Prosecutor Maria Santos argued during Sandra's sentencing hearing. Her manipulation of family relationships and systematic psychological abuse represent a particularly cruel form of criminal behavior that demands substantial punishment. Local news coverage of the case vindicated my character publicly and helped other fraud victims come forward with similar stories. Phoenix television stations interviewed me about recognizing the warning signs of family financial manipulation, and I appeared on Arizona radio programs discussing the psychological tactics used by sophisticated fraudsters. The media attention was initially uncomfortable, but it served important purposes. Other families contacted me with stories of similar inheritance theft and financial manipulation by family members. Local law enforcement agencies asked me to speak at training programs about recognizing elder abuse and financial fraud indicators. Most importantly, the publicity helped dozens of additional victims recover stolen assets and pursue justice against their own family members who had betrayed their trust. My nightmare had become a pathway to protecting other people from similar exploitation. 6 months after the arrests, I had completely rebuilt my life and created something far better than what Sandra had tried to destroy. The inheritance recovery, federal compensation, and asset seizure proceeds gave me financial security I had never imagined possible. More importantly, the ordeal had revealed who my real family members were and eliminated the toxic relationships that had been poisoning my life for years. 12 months after that devastating Thanksgiving confrontation, I stood in my reclaimed childhood home preparing for a completely different kind of family celebration. The kitchen where Sandra had once plotted my destruction now buzzed with genuine warmth and laughter as I cooked dinner for people who had proven their love through the most difficult test imaginable. Using my recovered inheritance and federal victim compensation funds, I had established the Rose Foundation in honor of my grandmother's memory and wisdom. The nonprofit organization specializes in helping families targeted by financial fraud, particularly cases involving elder abuse, inheritance theft, and manipulation of vulnerable family members. Derek left his position as a federal prosecutor to join the foundation as our legal counsel, bringing his expertise in white-collar crime and asset recovery to help families navigate complex fraud cases. His decision to abandon a prestigious career to help fraud victims demonstrated the depth of his commitment to justice and family loyalty. Uncle Paul, whose undercover investigation had been crucial to exposing the conspiracy, became our director of investigations. His law enforcement background and natural ability to build trust with victims made him perfect for helping families document financial manipulation and gather evidence for prosecution. We've helped 37 families recover stolen assets in our first year, Paul reported during our foundation board meeting. Total recovery amount exceeds $4 million, and we've referred 23 cases to federal prosecutors for criminal charges. Mrs. Rodriguez became one of our most valuable volunteers, using her bilingual skills and community connections to identify vulnerable families and educate them about financial fraud prevention. Her willingness to stand up to Sandra's witness tampering had inspired other community members to come forward with information about additional fraud schemes targeting elderly residents. People trust me because I'm a neighbor, not a government official, Mrs. Rodriguez explained during one of our community outreach events. I can explain complicated legal concepts in simple language and help families understand their rights without feeling embarrassed or overwhelmed. The foundation's success exceeded my wildest expectations, but the personal healing process was even more meaningful. Madison visited every weekend, and we slowly rebuilt our relationship through family therapy sessions that helped us understand how Sandra's manipulation had damaged our bond. I feel like I lost 2 years of my life believing lies about you, Madison said during one particularly emotional therapy session. Mom was so convincing, so detailed in her stories about your supposed mental health problems. I genuinely thought I was helping you by staying away. Our therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, helped both Madison and Harold understand the sophisticated psychological techniques Sandra had used to manipulate their perceptions and behavior. Sandra had exploited their love for me, turning their protective instincts into weapons for my emotional destruction. Skilled manipulators understand how to weaponize family dynamics, Dr. Walsh explained during a joint session. Sandra identified Harold's protective nature and Madison's trust in parental authority, then systematically exploited those qualities to achieve her criminal objectives. Harold's healing process was more complicated because of his unwitting participation in the veteran housing fraud. Learning that his signature had been used to steal from disabled veterans devastated him psychologically, even though federal prosecutors confirmed he was a victim rather than a willing criminal participant. I keep thinking about all those veterans who needed help and got robbed instead. Harold said during our first conversation after Sandra's sentencing, "I thought I was helping people who served our country, but I was actually making their lives worse." Harold had begun volunteering at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Phoenix, spending 3 days a week helping disabled veterans navigate benefit applications and housing assistance programs. His volunteer work was both community service and personal penance for his unwitting role in Marcus's fraud scheme. The Foundation's work attracted national attention when we helped expose a massive inheritance theft ring operating across 12 states. Our investigation techniques, developed through my personal experience with family financial manipulation, became a model for other victim advocacy organizations. The Rose Foundation's approach to family fraud investigation represents a breakthrough in victim advocacy, said Director Susan Martinez of the National Elder Justice Center during a conference presentation. Their combination of legal expertise, investigative skills, and emotional support provides comprehensive assistance that helps families heal from financial and psychological trauma. As I prepared our Thanksgiving dinner, I reflected on how profoundly my definition of family had changed. Sandra's betrayal had taught me that blood relationships mean nothing without trust, respect, and genuine care. Meanwhile, Derek, Paul, Mrs. Rodriguez, and even Dr. Walsh had become my chosen family through their unwavering support during my darkest moments. Madison arrived early to help with cooking, carrying flowers, and homemade rolls that reminded me of happier childhood celebrations. Harold brought his famous green bean casserole, though he seemed tentative and careful, still processing guilt about Sandra's manipulation of his love and trust. "I know I can't undo the damage I caused by believing her lies," Harold said as we worked together in the kitchen, "but I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built from this nightmare. Rose would be amazed by the foundation and all the families you've helped." Derek and Paul arrived together carrying legal briefs and case files because our foundation work never really stopped, even during holidays. They had been investigating a new inheritance theft case involving a military family in Tucson, and their dedication to justice inspired me daily. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous tamales and enough family photos to cover my dining room table. She'd appointed herself the Foundation's unofficial historian, documenting our success stories and creating photo albums of families we had helped reunite and heal. As we gathered around the table where Sandra had once planned my destruction, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought us together. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me had revealed reserves of strength I never knew I possessed and connected me with people whose love was genuine and unshakable. "Before we eat, I want to share something," I said, looking around the table at faces that represented my real family. "A year ago, I thought my life was completely ruined. I believed the lies about my character questioned my own judgment and felt completely alone in the world." The room grew quiet as I continued, but that nightmare led me to discover something precious that I never would have found otherwise. It showed me the difference between people who claim to love you and people who actually demonstrate love through their actions when you need them most. I looked directly at Derek, whose legal expertise and family loyalty had saved my life. Then at Paul, whose investigative skills and courage had exposed the truth. At Mrs. Rodriguez, whose refusal to lie for Sandra had protected my reputation. At Harold and Madison, whose willingness to face uncomfortable truths had allowed our family to heal authentically. The Rose Foundation exists because of what we've learned together about recognizing real love versus manipulation. I continued. Every family we help benefits from the wisdom we gained through surviving betrayal and choosing forgiveness over bitterness. Dr. Walsh had helped me understand that Sandra's actions reflected her own psychological damage rather than any failure on my part. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing Sandra's crimes or welcoming her back into my life. It meant refusing to let her cruelty poison my future relationships or prevent me from building something beautiful from the wreckage she had created. Rose always told me that our greatest growth comes from our greatest challenges. I concluded, raising my glass of sparkling cider. She would be proud that her inheritance became the foundation for helping other families protect themselves from what we survived. As we ate dinner and shared stories about foundation cases, I realized that Sandra's ultimate failure was not just legal, but philosophical. She had believed that money and manipulation could create lasting happiness, but her criminal empire had collapsed while my authentic relationships had grown stronger through testing. The foundation had given my pain a purpose and transformed my personal nightmare into a tool for protecting other families. Every case we solved, every family we reunited, every fraud scheme we exposed was a victory over the cruelty that Sandra represented. Before our guests left that evening, I asked them a question that had been on my mind for months. When someone you trust completely betrays you in the most devastating way possible, how do you rebuild your ability to trust new people without becoming cynical or closed off? Derek smiled and answered first. You learn to trust behavior over words. Actions reveal character more accurately than any promise or declaration. Paul nodded in agreement. And you start small. You don't have to trust someone with your life savings immediately. You can trust them with small things and see how they handle that responsibility. Mrs. Rodriguez offered wisdom from her decades of life experience. You remember that one person's cruelty doesn't predict everyone else's character. Sandra's choices reflected her problems, not your worth. Madison added thoughtfully, and you give people opportunities to prove their character during difficult situations because that's when you really learn who someone is. Harold's contribution surprised me with its insight. You accept that perfect safety doesn't exist, but you choose hope over fear because isolation is worse than the risk of being hurt again. Their answers reminded me that healing from betrayal isn't about building walls to prevent future pain. It's about developing wisdom to recognize genuine love, courage to remain open to new relationships, and strength to protect yourself without becoming bitter or suspicious. As I cleaned up after dinner, I thought about the question I wanted to ask you, the people listening to my story. Have you ever experienced betrayal so complete that it forced you to rebuild your understanding of trust, family, and love? How did you find the courage to open your heart again after someone you trusted used that trust to hurt you? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below because stories like mine prove that we're not alone in facing these challenges. Please hit the like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming life's most difficult betrayals and share this with anyone who might need to hear that healing and justice are possible, even after devastating betrayal. Thank you for listening to my journey from destruction to rebuilding. I hope Rose's legacy through our foundation continues helping families protect themselves and find strength in authentic love rather than manipulation. Sometimes the worst betrayal leads us to discover our greatest strength, our truest family, and our most meaningful purpose. The pain that nearly destroyed me became the foundation for protecting others and building something beautiful that will outlast any cruelty directed against it.